Is it not right?
Yeah. I didn't change it from last week, obviously. It's not Acts 8:30, 31.
Oh, I was like, the verse is right. Yes, it's 2 Timothy. We'll go with that. But we'll read this together out loud. Be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth. All right, well, today is the second and final part to our introduction of the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. As a reminder, for the next several months, we will be going through the confession. And so last time, my task assigned to me is to introduce the confession. And so last time was part 1 of the introduction, and today is obviously part 2, and it will also be the last part. And today will be all about the historical background of the confession. So all about the history. And of course, understand that the history we will go through is quite dense, and so I'm giving a 50,000-mile high overview. That way you have a fuller context and understand where this confession comes from, and then kind of understand the hows and the whys and the whats and everything. That way the actual context of the confession is not shrouded in mystery. And then when you understand the broader context and the historical background, that also helps you understand the confession a little bit more. But to assist with following along and keeping up with the history, I've made kind of 3 handouts that are right here in case you haven't gotten them yet. But basically, one is an outline of the lecture today. So basically, because we're going to move pretty quick, and I tend to be more of a visual learner, so it helps me if I have an outline. So I have made an outline for all of you. That way you can kind of follow along with it and keep up with the different events and topics that we'll cover. Some we'll spend more time on, some we'll spend less time on, but it's just to hit the high notes. Also created a glossary of terms, and then a fill-in-the-blank question sheet. So whatever helps you remember, whatever helps you learn, whatever helps you follow along, hopefully any of those will help. But the outline goes in order from the topics that we'll deal with today, and so does the glossary. So I tried to write everything so that they all present the terms to you in the order that we go through them. And then I also wrote the questions so that they focus on the key developments that led to the creation of the confession. And so when you put these 3 resources together, my hope is that they serve as references that you can go back to during the next few months of our study, or after the study if you have questions about the historical background or the English Reformation or Baptist history in general. But with that said, today we'll go ahead and we'll pick up from where we left off last time, which was kind of near the latter half of the Swiss Reformation, regarding Zwingli's views on the sacraments. And so last time pointed out that even though Zwingli's sacramental logic was entirely consistent with a rejection of infant baptism, he still upheld infant baptism. And this is because of the pseudo-theocratic union of church and state that existed during this time period. Zwingli did not want to open the can of worms that would have resulted from threatening that unity between church and state. There was someone, though, who did desire to open that can of worms, and his name was George Blarick, who was a Swiss priest born in 1491. Now, Blarick was the leader of a group of people in the Swiss Confederation called the Brethren. And the Brethren were a growing segment of the community who agreed with Zwingli's theology, but who also recognized the inconsistency in his logic of affirming infant baptism. They also believed that the combination of Rome's view of infant baptism with the unity of church and state was providing a false sense of salvation. Because what happened is people were looking to their baptism for proof of their salvation instead of true inward repentance. That's a problem because all citizens were required to be baptized as infants. And so you have a lot of people who are saying, well, my baptism is what I can look to my baptism as proof of salvation. And then the question is, well, who's baptized? And the answer is everyone. So everyone here was really dealing with this kind of large sense, or this kind of false sense of salvific assurance. And that is something that the brethren caught on to. And they said, well, the unity of church and state is an issue because of this unity, because people think that just because they're a member of the state or member of the church, etc., that they have salvation. And so, for this reason, the brethren were not only against infant baptism, but they also wanted to separate the church from the state. And they pushed Zwingli on these matters because Zwingli had the reputation. He had the kind of the power and the authority that came with being well known at this stage in his life. He had that influence. But Zwingli wouldn't budge. And so when it was clear that Zwingli would not be as radical as they wanted, George Blarick was baptized on January 21st, 1525. And this was important because Blarick, of course, had already been baptized as an infant. What he underwent on January 21st, 1525, was believer's baptism. The rest of the brethren followed suit. And those who then disagreed with Blarick and his followers began to call them Anabaptists, which means rebaptizers. Now, this was used as an insult. They were not stating a fact or anything. This was a pejorative term, because everyone during this time period was baptized as infants. But the Anabaptists did not believe they were getting rebaptized. They did not believe they were getting baptized a second time. They believed that the only valid baptism is believer's baptism, which is the baptism made after a profession of faith. And so they believed that infant baptism then was not a valid baptism. Because of this, by undergoing believer's baptism, the Anabaptists did not believe they were getting baptized a second time. They believed they were getting baptized for the first time, and the only time. Now, apart from their view on baptism, the Anabaptists did have some quirky views, such as being entirely pacifistic and being anti-war. They did not believe in the taking of oaths, including in the political or governmental context. And unfortunately, the Anabaptists progressively became a bit cultish and even a revolutionary movement. They began to physically go to war against the local governments and the church. And they ended up facing massive persecution until a new leader, Menno Simons, led the Anabaptists back to their roots and successfully steered them away from revolutionary Anabaptism. Menno Simons' followers eventually were known as the Mennonites. And the Mennonites were persecuted still because they didn't deviate from that original Anabaptist belief. So they were still persecuted due to their subversive beliefs, and they scattered themselves to numerous other countries, which actually helped the Mennonites grow in number. So while certainly there are some views of the Anabaptists that we disagree with, from a sacramental perspective, you do have a foreshadowing of Baptistic theology in the Swiss Reformation from Zwingli, the Anabaptists, and the Mennonites. And this will connect a little bit later to what we'll talk about later today. But the thought process and logic of rejecting infant baptism was there, and it was within the minds of many people. But again, due to the intertwining of the church and state, a rejection of infant baptism was quite messy. It was quite a difficult ordeal. But this now leads us to part 2 of the historical background of the London Baptist Confession of Faith, which is the English Reformation. The English Reformation. So moving on from the Swiss Confederation to England. All right, so during the same time that Luther and Zwingli are reforming the church in their countries, England is also undergoing a reformation, but in a different direction. So the story starts in 1509 with the marriage of Henry VIII, King of England, and Catherine of Aragon, who's a daughter of the Spanish monarchy. Catherine was the widow of Henry's older brother, Arthur, and church law forbade the marriage of a man to his brother's widow. So when Catherine was unable to provide Henry with a son, and who would be a male heir, the church looked upon this as God's punishment for breaking church law. Henry desired an annulment between himself and Catherine because he couldn't get a male heir. She just would not bear him a son, and so he took that personally, and he wanted a divorce so he could marry someone who would give him a male heir. But the Catholic Church refused to grant the annulment. They would not let him divorce his wife. And the Catholic Church had the power in that time period to refuse that. They could authorize divorce and they could refuse divorce. Consequently, Henry VIII decided to take matters into his own hands, and he separated from Rome entirely and created his own church called the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church. He declared himself the head of the church and then gave himself permission to divorce his wife. So that is exactly how that went. So so to distill it, he basically went to the church and said, I want a divorce. They said no, and he said, okay, well, you're going to regret this. And they were like, what are you going to do, start your own church? And that's exactly what he did. He started his own church, separated entirely from Rome, and then made himself the head of his own church that he started. I do want to be clear, though, the creation of the Church of England was purely political and not theological. Henry VIII was not a Protestant by any means. If anything, he was probably more Catholic. What Henry hated was not Roman Catholicism, but how much power the Roman Catholic Church had over the state. That was what Henry hated. As the king, he didn't like being told what to do. So he created his own church and made himself the head of it. So now the Church of England is literally the Church of England. It is the national church of England. And so this actually turned into quite a blessing for the Protestants, though. Because due to the explosion of Reformed theology, by separating with Rome, or from Rome, Henry VIII actually inadvertently allowed the proliferation of Reformed theology and doctrine in England. Because there was no one really to persecute the Protestants there. He separated from Rome. And so you don't have Rome's direct involvement in England directly stopping the growth of Protestantism. And so as a result, Reformed theology was allowed to grow in England almost entirely without obstacle for a brief period. Now, after Henry died, his daughter, Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary, outlawed Protestantism once again. And there's a reason for that, and I went into that a little bit more in the glossary, but she ended up outlawing Protestantism once again and enacted a series of persecutions against the Protestants. But the damage was already done because Reformed theology had fully infiltrated England thanks to Henry. And the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So the only thing that Mary's persecutions did was further strengthen the pre-existing English reformers and people's commitment to Protestantism. The Protestants were already there thanks to Henry. They spread their roots and they got planted. And then the only thing the persecutions did was just make them even stronger. And so that just solidified their position there. Now at this point, you must imagine the mindset of the reformers in England. Because in England, you have a new church that is pretty much one with the country of England. It is the national church. If a church is led by the state, then both the state and the church can, of course, become extremely powerful weapons for both good and evil. Because, imagine a church that has all the breadth, influence, and financial backings of an entire country. That church would have potential to do massive amounts of good in the name of Christ. Well, that is the Church of England. And there were some reformers in England who understood this, and they saw the separation of the church from Catholicism, but they understood that the separation was purely political. And they understood that many in the state and many even in the church couldn't care less about the theology. It was more about power. It was more about separating from Rome and consolidating the power of the monarchy. And they understood that. They understood that the Church of England was very much a political toy. And so they saw that the Church of England, while not Roman Catholic, was still not operating from biblical theology. Because the point of the separation from Rome, at least in the reformers' mind, the point of the separation from Rome wasn't just to be separate from Rome. It was to reform. It was to go back to biblical theology and to have an actual theology that was based on the Scriptures. Because if you have poor theology, but your response is, yeah, but at least I'm not Roman Catholic, that's not a good baseline. And so these individuals then, they thought to reform the Church of England even further, beyond mere separation from Catholicism. And they didn't think that it was good enough for the Church of England to just not be Roman Catholic. They wanted the Church of England to go further than that and to be as biblical as possible in its theology. In a word, they sought to purify the Church of England. And so these English reformers were named the Puritans. So the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England and truly reform it from the inside. Now, there are some who agreed with the Puritans theologically, but did not believe reforming the Church of England was the way to go. And instead, they believed that the proper action was to separate from the Church of England and to start their own churches. And these individuals were called separatists. So the separatists left the Church of England, and many left England altogether, and moved to different parts of the world, including America. And the separatists specifically who made the pilgrimage to America are called the Pilgrims. So you probably remember that term. But the Pilgrims were separatists from England. And there's not really a big theological difference between the Puritans and the Separatists. They're coming out of the same stream. They just had two different views of what to do with the church. Some were saying, hey, is it worth actually reforming the church and going through all this trouble, putting our lives and our spouses and our children at risk? Probably not. It's probably better if we try to start our own churches and start from scratch and start over. And then the Puritans said, no, it's better to stay here and reform the church from within. So you don't have really two different theological mindsets between the two. You just have two mindsets, differing mindsets regarding what to do with the Church of England. Now, among the Puritans, who were the English reformers who stayed in England to reform the church, there was a division regarding church government. Some Puritans argued that churches should be ruled by collections of elders, such that churches should be under the supervision of or held accountable to other churches. This was a mirror of what Calvin did in Geneva, and Scotland followed suit. And so you had a lot of these individuals who agreed with this because of the Scottish Reformation and because of Calvin's Geneva, who came from Calvin's University, and so on and so forth, where they argued that churches should be under the supervision of other churches. This position was called the presbytery position, also known as Presbyterian. Now, the other group argued that churches should be independent from one another and each ruled by their own personal body of elders. And this group was called the Congregationalists, or the Independents. And it was out of these Congregationalists that the Baptist denomination came. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. But you have these two groups. You got the Puritans and you have the Separatists, who are divided based on what to do with the Church of England. And then you have Puritans and Congregationalists, where the Puritans are Presbyterian in their church polity and their view of church government, but then Congregationalists are aligned more with with Baptists in the sense of congregations should be elder ruled and not led by other churches or be under the authority of other churches. And so they're independent. All right, so now going back to the political scene. Since the Separatists left the Church of England, because Separatists, they separated, so the Separatists are gone. Since the Separatists left the Church of England, what you now have left are all the Puritans who remained in England, who are a collection of Presbyterians and Congregationalists and Baptists. And so all of these are furiously itching to reform the Church of England. And so proliferous are these Puritans that they make up every part of society, including government, and more importantly, Parliament. Which now brings us to part 3 of our historical background, which is the English Civil War. The English Civil War. So now we fast forward to 1603, when James I of England becomes King of England. James was first King of Scotland, and then he inherited the crown of England. One thing about Scotland is that he was a royal absolutionist, meaning in Scotland he had full control, full power, full reign, full authority. He really didn't have to negotiate with government, with anything like that. He was fully in control. When he got the crown of England, this was a completely different story. And he was so used to being a king in Scotland that he did not expect to run into any political obstacles whatsoever when it came to leading England. And so we're close to a century of Reformation in England at this point. And with the creation of the Church of England, there are numerous attempts from Protestants and Catholics to win the church, and also numerous attempts from the monarchy of England to win the loyalty of both the Protestants and the Catholics. Because the Church of England, it's new, and it's kind of middle ground. It's kind of this neutral territory between Protestantism and Catholicism. It's not Catholic enough for the Catholics, and it's not Protestant enough for the Protestants. And so what you really have is a series of negotiations and compromises and battles and squabbles and all of these conflicts between the Catholics and between the Protestants to try to win the Church of England for their own theological bent. And then in the middle of that, you also have the monarchy, and the monarchy is trying to also get credit from both of them. He's trying to get brownie points from the Protestants and the Catholics because of the Church of England structure, and because of England's structure, the bishops and the episcopacy still has power, and he knows that, and so the king is trying to get loyalty from somebody. So he's like, either I get loyalty from the Protestants or I get loyalty from the Catholics. And Henry VIII kind of tried that too. He started with the Protestants when he learned that they wouldn't really be his friends. He went to the Catholics and he kind of went back and forth. And then like his multiple 27 marriages was all about trying to appease the different Protestants and Catholics. And then he would divorce one, take another, and that's kind of what you have here with the inception of the Church of England. It's a lot of political chaos, and so you have a lot of that going in the background. And what that did is it resulted in a mixture of Protestant and Catholic doctrines and regulations in the Church of England. So it was you kind of had a mix. It's kind of Protestant, kind of Catholic. And so they both fought for power. But there was one thing that the English Protestants, who are Puritans, had that the Catholics did not, and that was Parliament. Specifically, the House of Commons, which was the lower chamber in Parliament. And so the House of Commons included numerous Puritans. And the Puritans did not like James I, the king, whatsoever. Why this matters, though, is because while Parliament generally did not have any significant roles, there was one role in particular that made it quite significant, which was the ability to raise revenue through taxes. The House of Commons was essentially the representative of the common people in England. And so taxation really could not occur without the agreement of the House of Commons as they represented the people. And so the king needed the House of Commons in order to tax, in order to raise revenue, in order to get more money for the House. And so why that matters specifically here, though, is because this was a particular problem for James I, because James I was not a Dave Ramsey follower, and he spent liberally. He was horrible with how he spent his money. And he ran out of money very quickly to support his various initiatives. And so he tried to go to Parliament several times to get more taxes, to get more revenue. And repeatedly, the Puritan Parliament would not hear him out. They wouldn't hear him out unless he would enact regulations in the church that they wanted him to enact. And so that created a complex, drawn-out series of conflicts between the Puritans and Parliament and the King of England and the Catholic episcopacy. Now, this conflict reached a boiling point after the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633 orders everyone in the Kingdom of England and Scotland to allow the Anglican to follow the Anglican liturgy. Just a brief background. So Great Britain, England, Ireland, Scotland, they're all together. And so the crown at this point, so remember, James I is now king of both. He's king of Scotland, he's king of England. And so his archbishop, who is the leader in the Church of England, he calls Scotland to follow the Anglican liturgy, and he has full authority to do that. And so he calls Scotland to follow the Anglican liturgy, which basically, which has elements of Catholic theology, and saying if you do not follow the Church of England, if you do not conform to the Church of England, then you will be persecuted. You will be imprisoned. You are a threat to the crown. And so Scotland, in just classic Scottish fashion, responded by utterly abolishing any form of Catholic episcopacy and restructured the Church of Scotland to be entirely and completely Presbyterian. That was their response. You want us to be Catholic? Absolutely not. You know what? We're going to be Protestant even harder now. We are going to all the Catholics we were tolerating them, but no more. They're out, they're gone, no more Catholics. We are now fully Presbyterian. And that obviously was an act of outright defiance against the king. And at this point, who was Charles I. So no longer James, this is Charles. So Charles I is now the king. So outright defiance. And so Charles had no choice but to go to war against Scotland. Because again, this was outright defiance. This was a sign of rebellion against the king. Again, this is a problem because he has no money. And so he had to, once again, turn to Parliament, who was at this point even more populated by Puritans than it was under James I. And Charles I was now much more desperate for Parliament's help. And Charles I was so desperate for Parliament's support that he was almost willing to do whatever Parliament wanted him to do. And Parliament knew it. So Parliament, they were very aware that the power they had over the king at this point. And so what follows here is essentially a long, drawn-out series of negotiations and compromises between the king and Parliament. And this event is referred to as the Long Parliament. Yes, ma'am. He was Catholic. He's probably kind of right in the middle in that neutral territory. But yeah, it was everything there was still neutral because they didn't want to go too far to the left or too far to the right. At the time of James I, though, he was very much leaning to the Catholic side because the Catholics were his main source of support. They were the ones where basically because of his lifestyle and his licentiousness and everything else, he pretty much had lost the Puritan support. There was no way they were going to support him or even like him. And so he pretty much realized that. And so he turned his attention to the Catholics and trying to win them over. Whether or not they ascribed to one theology or the other, a lot of it was purely political because he was trying to gain support for the crown. This event that occurred where Charles I and Parliament are trying to make negotiations between one another, this is called the Long Parliament. And during the Long Parliament, the Puritan part of Parliament sought to create regulations that allowed the proliferation of Reformed theology and protect the Puritans from those in the government who previously wished to do them harm. So the Puritans are trying to enact laws that allow more religious liberty, that allow them to practice Reformed theology and, of course, to reform the Church of England even further and try to strip it from the doctrine that it has. Now, during the Long Parliament, the House of Commons became more rebellious and continued to attempt various maneuvers to rebel against the king. The king did a lot of shady stuff during this time as well. And so you have a lot of things that are going on because they're both trying to negotiate in person, but behind the scenes and in the shadows, they're both trying to pull some strings to further manipulate these negotiations. And so they're all nice and polite in person during the Long Parliament, but you have a lot of other things that are going on in the background on the King's side and on the House of Commons side that are really where they're trying to pull the strings. And that's what that does, though, is it is actually adding more fuel to the fire. And so, what ends up happening? One of the kind of chief maneuvers that kind of tipped that kind of tipped the whole thing over, is that it was uncovered allegedly that the Queen was attempting to cause a rebellion in Ireland as a way of creating urgency for Parliament to grant the king the funding he needed to squash out many conflicts. Because basically, you have this whole rebellion that's taking place. The king can't do really much about it because he needs the money. Parliament won't give him the money. So the thought is that the Queen went to Ireland, tried to strike this rebellion to make the Irish rebel against the crown, so that basically they can make the argument, you need to give us the money now, you need to allow us to do the taxes now, because if you don't, we're all going to be goners. Not just me, but you. Not just the crown, but also Parliament, because all of our country is at risk. So you need to do this right this second, because all of our lives are dependent on it. We can deal with these theological differences and political differences later, etc., And so the Queen went to Ireland to strike that rebellion to give a sense of urgency so that the Parliament would more quickly give the king the money that he needed. Now, when this scheme was uncovered, the House of Commons became even more rowdy and intended to place the Queen on trial. They essentially accused the Queen of treason. And the king, his back was against a wall now. He knew that there was really nothing that he could do to get out of it, and so he needed to move quickly to remove these rebellious fellows from the House of Commons, to kind of remove those people who were rebelling. So he lodged an accusation against them of treason, insurrection, and other charges. So you have some people that are accusing the Queen of treason, and now the king is accusing those people of treason, and so they're pointing fingers at each other. But the king is saying, all right, well, you know what? I'm officially placing you all under arrest. And the king now said that we are coming for you, and we are going to arrest you. Now, Parliament refused to give them up. Parliament refused to give those members up to him for arrest, and so then the king sent a military force to capture them. So decided to capture them by force. Turns out, though, not just Parliament was against Charles, but even the people of London, such that the entire city started to fight back against the king and his military when he tried to arrest them. And so since Charles had no money, he was forced to retreat and hide in his palace. From here, so basically you have no king. King's gone. King's hiding. He's not in Parliament anymore. And so from here, the Puritans kind of enacted measures to give themselves further control. And one of the first things they did in Parliament was expel the Catholic bishops. They passed a series of measures to kick them out. They could totally do it because the Puritans were in the majority. So they voted, and they're like, yeah, we don't want the Catholics, and they kicked them out. And so it granted the Puritans almost unilateral control at that point. And then because of the king's prior action in sending his military after them, the Parliament obviously felt threatened, and so then they passed an act to create their own militia. The king then further gathered his army as well to fight against Parliament and Parliament's new army, and so now you have the English Civil War, where you have Parliament going against the king. So now, remember, at this time, Scotland is almost entirely Presbyterian, or really is entirely Presbyterian. And Scotland is also part of the Kingdom of Great Britain. Further, Scotland had the strongest and largest army in the kingdom. As such, Parliament sought to enter into a military alliance with Scotland to help them fight against the king. Because again, Parliament's still relatively small. They understand the gravity here. The king is the king. He has an army, he has military, etc. And so Parliament, they realize the precarious position that they're in. And so they realize they need reinforcements, they need help. And they also realize that as Puritans, they all are pretty much aligned with Scotland in terms of their theology. And so they seek a military alliance with Scotland to help them fight against the king. Now, Scotland would only engage in such an alliance if it were agreed that the Church of England would be restructured based on a Presbyterian system of church government and Protestant theological doctrine. Now, Scotland had some skin in the game too. If you're wondering why they cared what the Church of England had, it's because the Church of England was the Church of England, and they regularly tried to enact this against Scotland. And so Scotland is like, no, let's squash this once and for all. Let's truly reform the Church of England. And so they all agreed. Now, the question, of course, became, what does a Presbyterian system of church government look like, and what would that entail for the Church of England? And then what Protestant doctrines and theology in particular should be adhered to and enacted? As in, what is Protestant theology? What is Reformed theology? What are the tenets, the core fundamental tenets of the faith, and how can we write that out? How can we declare that? How can we confess that? And so to assist with these questions and the negotiations between Scotland and England, Parliament called together a group of theologians whose role was to create documents that outlined the doctrinal standards of the restructured Church of England. These representatives met at Westminster Abbey, and they comprised what would be known as the Westminster Assembly, which consisted of 121 English clergymen, 30 laymen, and then representatives from Scotland. The assembly consisted of notable theologians and biblical scholars, and then those who were adept at biblical languages, and these were known as the Westminster Divines, those who met at the Westminster Abbey. And their resulting body of work was called the Westminster Confession of Faith. And this confession served as the primary confession of the Presbyterians and does to this very day. Now, the purpose of this document was to be a collection of beliefs that everyone in the Church of England adhered to. And since it covers the topics of church government, it also served for how the Church of England was to be structured. Thus, the purpose of this confession was to purify the Church of England, because again, this is the role of the Puritans. The purpose of the confession was to purify the Church of England, to turn it away, officially, from Roman Catholicism, and to root it in sound biblical theology. And it was adopted for common use by the Church of England in 1647. Published in 1646, and then it was adopted fully in 1647. Now, after this, since Parliament and the King of England were in open war against one another, and since Parliament did not acknowledge the King's authority, Parliament grew in power and continued to grow in power to the extent of lawfully having the king beheaded. From there, England obviously had no king. King's gone, literally. King's dead. They have no monarch. And so the Parliament grew in power, and they continued to grow, and then they went through a period, very brief period, but it was almost like a short-term governmental experiment, and Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan and former advisor of the king, became the monarchical representative before Parliament, and Oliver Cromwell worked towards converting England into a republic. He died before that could happen, however, and his son took his place, but his son shortly resigned due to inability to effectively rule. When that occurred, England could not find a lawful replacement nor successor, and so no choice remained but to restore the monarchy. And then Charles II took the crown in 1660. Now, when this occurred, of course, Charles II had been in hiding all up until this point. So when they made the decision to restore the monarchy, Charles II came back. And then obviously took the crown. But when this occurred, Charles II wanted to ensure that no Protestant rebellion would occur again. Like that's the main thing. He's like, I don't want these crazy Protestants to pull anything again. I don't want another rebellion to break out. And so he set his eyes on expelling Protestant theology from the Church of England. So when he took the crown, he immediately overturned the standards of the Westminster Assembly. That's why the Church of England today does not abide by those standards. He immediately overturned the standards of the Westminster Assembly and returned the church to an episcopal form of church government. He also passed a law that would ensure the persecution or imprisonment of anyone who did not conform with the Church of England. This is another period in time when the Puritans and the Presbyterians and Congregationalists and Baptists, etc., when they all were persecuted. Also the period in which John Bunyan was in prison for his refusal to conform to the Church of England and when he wrote The Pilgrim's Progress. I throw that out there so you kind of are a little bit more familiar with what time period we're talking about. That this is after the restoration of the monarchy. And those who refused to conform with the Church of England were called nonconformists, and they were persecuted or thrown in prison. Now, eventually, the Act of Toleration was passed in 1689, and this allowed religious liberty. And then everyone, including Baptists, could practice their faith without persecution. All right, so that will do it for the historical background of the Westminster Confession. Now, with the short time we have left, we will briefly turn our attention to the development of the London Baptist Confession, which came out of the Westminster Confession, and we'll focus first on the history of the Baptist denomination. So earlier, you'll remember that we mentioned the Congregationalists, who were Puritans, who believed in a congregational style of church government, meaning that they believed churches should rule themselves independently and not be subject to the authority of other churches. During the parliamentary squabbles and historical events that we just talked about, we also have the formation of the Baptist denomination occurring. So this starts in 1606 when an Anglican priest named John Smith became convicted that the Bible taught that churches should be ruled independently and not by other churches or not in episcopacy status or process. And so he created his own church that was separate from the Church of England. And that, of course, was illegal. So to avoid persecution, he and a friend of his named Thomas Helwys sailed to Amsterdam, where Smith was a pastor once again. But during his time there, John Smith came in contact with the Mennonites, and he adopted their views on pacifism and oath-taking and pretty much everything that they believed, and including a rejection of infant baptism. Now, Thomas Helwys, the friend who traveled with him, agreed with the rejection of infant baptism, but heavily disagreed with John's decision to join the Mennonite denomination. And both John Smith and Thomas Helwys split ways. It went so far as John Smith actually got excommunicated from the church. Now, while John Smith stayed in Amsterdam, Helwys went back to England and started the First Baptist Church. From there, Baptist theology spread among England and Europe. Of note, though, is that Helwys was an Arminian. And so the initial Baptist church that he started was not reformed in its theology. As the Baptist denomination grew, though, the denomination became divided between those who were reformed in their theology and those who were not. So there were Baptists who argued that Jesus died for everybody generally, and these individuals were called the General Baptists. The General Baptists. Then there were those who believed that Jesus died only for the elect in particular, and these were called the Particular Baptists. So the Particular Baptists are the Reformed Baptists. What you now have is a collection of individuals in London and the early and mid 1600s who were Congregationalists. But you also have, among the Congregationalists, those who rejected infant baptism. And so those who rejected infant baptism, they could be Anabaptists, they could be General Baptists, they could be Particular Baptists, maybe you have a couple of Mennonites in there. And so while they were united on a rejection of infant baptism, the theological differences between Anabaptists and General Baptists and Particular Baptists were like the difference between night and day. So consequently, the Particular Baptists sought a way to distinguish themselves from the Anabaptists and the General Baptists and to make clear that they were directly aligned with the Reformers and their theology. As in, like, hey, I'm tired of people thinking I'm an Anabaptist, or I'm tired of people thinking I'm a Mennonite, I'm tired of people thinking I'm a General Baptist. We are aligned with the Protestant Reformation and with the Reformers. And so to this end, 7 Particular Baptist churches came together, and in 1644, they produced the first London Baptist Confession of Faith. This was 2 years before the Westminster Confession was written, and the purpose of this confession was to declare that the Particular Baptists were a distinct denomination and separate from the General Baptists and Anabaptists, and to spell out their theology and show that they were united with the Protestant Reformers and the rest of their Puritan brothers and sisters. But what about the Congregationalists? We know the Baptists made a confession, we know the Presbyterians did, but what are the Congregationalists? Well, after the Westminster Confession was finished, the Congregationalists affirmed all of its theology except, of course, when it came to church government. Consequently, an assembly of Congregationalist leaders met in 1658, and they used the Westminster Confession as their template, and essentially, they only adjusted the Westminster Confession such that it affirmed a congregational form of church government. This version of the Westminster Confession was called the Savoy Declaration. And it is almost identical with the Westminster Confession, of course, other than its view on church government. Now, even still, since not all Congregationalists were Baptists, the Savoy Declaration did not go far enough for a third group, and that was the Particular Baptists, once again. Consequently, a collection of Particular Baptists met in 1677, and they edited the Savoy Declaration to affirm only believers' baptism, so to reject infant baptism. And this revised version was called the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, to distinguish it from the First London Baptist Confession of Faith that was written in 1644. However, like we discussed earlier, this confession was written after the restoration of the monarchy. So this was after Charles II took over. So this was during the time of those persecutions against the church and against those who didn't conform. And so the Second London Baptist Confession was written during a period of persecution for anyone who deviated from the Church of England. So while it was written in 1677, this confession was released anonymously. But then in God's providence, the Act of Toleration was passed in 1689. And the Act of Toleration was the act that allowed religious freedom. So now you didn't have the fear of persecution. You didn't have the fear of death or imprisonment for not conforming to the Church of England. And so in that same year, in 1689, particular Baptist leaders met that same year to provide some finishing touches to the confession, and including now they added a preface to the confession, which is what we have. You have now in our in the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. That is the preface from when they met together in 1689 after the Act of Toleration, and then they re-released the Second Confession in that same year, 1689. Hence, why it is called the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. And now I know I got to wrap up, but just for one last point, the reason the London Baptist Confession used the Westminster Confession as its template is not because the writers of the London Baptist Confession were lazy. Instead, it is actually because the writers wanted to establish and display unity with their Westminster allies. And if you read the confession, and you read the foreword, the introduction, the preface, etc., they actually say that in the preface. They actually go out and state, here is why we did this. We are establishing unity with our Westminster allies and our Westminster brothers. And so by using the Westminster Confession as the template, they were affirming their agreement with and connection to the Protestant Reformation, distinguishing themselves from the general Baptists. And the particular Baptists wanted to be clear that even though they believed in congregational ecclesiology and they rejected infant baptism, they were not under the Anabaptist umbrella, nor were they part of the general Baptists. And so by using the Westminster Confession and editing it slightly, they were emphasizing how much they, as Baptists, agreed with their Congregationalist and Presbyterian counterparts. And so had they made an entirely new confession, that would be a slap in the face to the Westminster Assembly. And so the London Baptist Confession was therefore showing unity with the other members of the Reformed tradition. And that's I think the more significant point that I want us all to take away from this, which is that the Reformed Baptists have their roots directly in the Protestant Reformation in general, and the English Reformation in particular. The Reformed Baptist denomination has its roots in Puritanism. And further, and we'll talk about this later in the upcoming months, but we can see that the particular Baptists ascribe to covenant theology as well. We see that in the 1689 Confession. And so therefore, Reformed Baptists did not come centuries after this period of time, nor even decades after this time. Reformed Baptists existed among and from the Puritans and participated in all of these events that occurred in the English Reformation. All these events that we just got done talking about, the particular Baptists are there. And they're going through all of this along with the rest of the English Reformers. And so to be a Reformed Baptist then is to stand side by side with the Protestant Reformers and the English Reformers and to have roots directly in the Puritans and the Reformed tradition. And so that will conclude our study on the historical background of the Confession. But I'll close us there today. But any questions, comments? I know it was a lot. Sir.
James first, he was the James of the King James Bible, correct?
I believe so. There's lots of Jameses.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Closes in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we love you and we thank you for your mercy and your grace, and we thank you for even the story of redemption and the story of salvation that you tell through history, how you have orchestrated all of these events, that you have orchestrated all of these things and occurrences throughout all of history to tell the story of salvation and redemption, and to bring your church out of all of the darkness that we see with Roman Catholicism. And so, Father, we thank you for the mercy, but we thank you for the inspiration and the encouragement that we can also draw just from listening to and reading and learning from all of these exemplary men and women who have given their lives and who have risked their lives to abstain from the popular theology, or to abstain from following what is popular and what is not as risky and what is easy, but instead for these individuals who went the difficult way, who went the way of following you, and who went the way of conforming to the truth of your word rather than a man-made religion, rather than a man-made political scheme. And so we thank you for sustaining them by the power of your Spirit, and for giving them the endurance to finish the race well, that we may stand upon their shoulders and upon their backs and upon all that they have done, just to get Bibles in our hands, and just to get the truths of your word into our hands, and all of these resources that we have now. And so may we never take this for granted. May we never take for granted for a second the abundance of resources we have, particularly the abundance of resources on Reformed theology, which we believe are biblical theology. May we always remember that these things were bought with a price, and that all of these things that we have come from the martyrs of the church. And so, Father, we ask that weighs down heavily upon us, but may we also take encouragement from that, and may we also be encouraged and motivated that if we are ever in a situation like that where we have to choose between death and following you, that we will choose death every time, because we love you and we will follow you to the end. But Father, we ask this morning that you empower our brother Stephen as he preaches before us today. We ask that you give us focus and clarity of mind, and that may our worship be done in obedience to you. And we pray these things in the name of your Son. Amen.